and talk, but in the 19th century, it wasn't a park. It was the site of DC's earliest Quaker cemetery, founded in 1807, a small quarter acre, and then in 1870, right after the Civil War, it became DC's busiest Reconstruction era Black cemetery. And that occupied most of this land. I call this the happy whale. The shape of it reminds me of a whale. And both cemeteries were forced to close in 1890 due to neighborhood development. In 2005, 20 years ago, a neighbor and I were confronted with a question. It's sort of a Zen-like question. When does a cemetery stop being a cemetery? Is it when it's no longer visible? Is it when all the graves have been removed? Is it when the land is being put to other uses? Or is it when people forget? I live 2 blocks from Walter Pierce Park in Adams Morgan. And in 2005, a neighbor and I, another history buff, discovered a bobcat at Walter Pierce Park. Not a wild animal, a bobcat tractor. And it looked like digging was taking place. There were several gaping holes in the ground covered by tarps. Of course, we had to look under the tarps because that's who we are. But we both knew, my friend and I, my neighbor and I, that this had once been a cemetery, so it was a little shocking to find a bobcat tractor digging in known cemetery land. We really knew nothing more than that, okay? City officials, we soon discovered, were planning to undertake a major construction project in the park, and this was the archaeological box they were ticking off. They were saying, we brought the bobcat out, we did some digging, we found just a few little things, but nothing of significance, no graves. They wanted to build, the city wanted to build 4 very large gardening terraces in the park. And you know, when our city builds anything, it overbuilds. And these were gonna involve major disruptions to about 1/3 of the park. We expressed concerns, a group of us, and it didn't take long for a group to form. We expressed concerns that this construction project might disrupt graves that were still in the park. There was nothing marked. We couldn't see any graves. But we knew from the history of the site that there might be graves. And for the next 9 months, we publicly battled with the city over whether or not this construction project should move forward. I made a cold call to Howard University's anthropology department. And oddly enough, the person they put me through to had just completed most of the work on the African Burial Ground project in New York. Does everyone know about the African Burial Ground project? That was a landmark project that awakened New Yorkers to their history of enslavement in their city. So it was startling, and it was controversial, and it was messy, and it was wrong that the Howard University scientists had to go up there and protect a cemetery, but they did. So the first person I got through to on the phone was a man named Mark Mack, and he became a dear friend and mentor of mine, and he said yes, he would help. Throughout this time, city officials continued to claim that there were no graves left in the park, that they'd all been removed at a much earlier date. Remember that the cemeteries closed in 1890, so 125 years had lapsed between the time of the cemetery's visible existence and the time this garden project was going to occur, this community gardening terrace building project. So it's a complicated situation with the city. among our group of people were descendants of people who were buried there, although we didn't really know quite who was buried there. It was people with a feeling of kinship to the people who might have been buried there. And some of us were black and some of us were white. There was a kinship. Anthropologists have a name for it. It's called fictive kinship, made up kinship. But it was a deep sense.
Say fictive?
Fictive, as in fictional.
Fictive,
Fictive,
okay.
yeah. So I was a fictive kin. I'm obviously white. But there were white people there too, because there was a Quaker cemetery.
Yeah.
Just a lot fewer of the white people. But sometimes these very complicated issues come down to finding the right question. Come down to a simple question. How many people had been buried in the cemeteries at Walter Pierce Park? We asked the city. Turns out the city didn't know how many people had been buried there, but they were all removed. That was the claim. This is the value of a little research. How many people were buried there? I don't expect you to read this article, but in 1889, as city officials were contemplating closing the cemetery for health reasons, the records indicated that in 10 years, 4,700 people had been buried there. Since the cemeteries were in operation for 20 years, and the Quaker Cemetery for a much longer time, we knew that it had to be more than 5,000 people buried there. It wasn't a simple rural cemetery at the side of some church. It was a major cemetery. And city officials knew that thousands of people's graves had not been removed. So the city gave in. Oh, by the way, we also told the city we would like Howard University to document the site before any construction took place, and they rejected our offer. Not because it was expensive, because we said we would get private funding for it. They just didn't want it. They wanted to go through with the project. So turns out thousands of folks' graves were there. And in 2006, Mark Mack, who's on the left, and Ike Masumbi and Maisha Hegwood all were part of a team of students and volunteers to begin the work at Walter Pierce Park. And by the way, ethical standards had been set at the African burial ground in New York that said leave people in place, don't disturb graves unnecessarily, don't dig, just find the evidence. Find the evidence in other ways. And so this was what you call a surface survey, a non-invasive survey.
Did they use that ground penetrating radar?
We did eventually, but first of all, we went meter by meter through the park, and this is them laying the survey lines for the work. So what I'm going to do now, to not hold you in suspense, is show you some of the finds that we had on the surface of the earth. And by the way, we found many things, including some exposed remains, but I'm not going to show photos of that. So let me just go through several of the finds here. This was the sort of thing we found. Coffin handle. Did you know that there are hardware catalogs from the 1800s that show you what you can buy to build a coffin? I mean, they were for, the coffin makers and the cabinet makers. So this one is identical to this. That's a pretty obvious cemetery item, right? These were much harder to see. I was there the day that these were found. You can barely see it, But these things are coffin hardware. That's why it's good that students are young people, because they can really see things. And especially go somewhere with an archaeological student and wow. So you'll see that these are very similar to these tacks and decorative coverings of nails that are used on coffins. One practice in African American cemeteries that has more often been documented in the South than in the Mid-Atlantic is the placing of broken porcelain and toys and seashells on top of graves. So we found a lot of these sort of instances where grave goods were scattered on tops of graves. After about 4 years, we found our first intact headstone. And again, I happened to be there the day that they found it, and it was, what? We've looked in this place before, but there's a lot of overgrowth, and there it was. So the students picked up the stone to see whether there was any carving on it. There wasn't. A lot of the headstones or the grave markings at those times were less formal. They were maybe big stones that weren't carved, or they were painted wooden headboards with messages. But in this case, we couldn't find any engraving on it. I went over to Mount Zion Cemetery in Georgetown and measured their known headstones. They were exactly the same width, or thickness, and proportions. So you can see that there were 2 headstones in that picture of the field. Again, these were surface finds. Can everybody see this one? This man is a very African-looking metal sculpture. He has his head tilted up. To me, at first, he looked like a king or a magician. He's probably a Christ figure or a transformational image of some sort. I think he may have been used at funerals, graveside services. The things he's holding in his hands are hollow. They're hollow. And so he may have been a candle holder or an incense burner. When we found items like this that were so unique, we did not leave them in place at the site. We took them to the Howard Biological Anthropology Laboratory, where they're stored and curated. One more thing to know about African American funerals of this time, whereas the Quaker funerals were very quiet, sort of boring affairs with people speaking up, and I know a Quaker in the audience is nodding in agreement. The African American funerals at the time involved brass bands, if they were particularly influential individuals or belonged to special fraternal orders or sororital orders, is that a word? Anyway, they belonged to groups, like the village. They would have brass bands, they would have dozens of carriages. But we also discovered that some people were so poor that their neighbors collected for them to pay for their funeral costs, or the city paid for the funeral costs. So there was quite a mix of folks here. All right, now, this is, we're getting to part 3 of this 4-part presentation. So while the students, including women, there's no women in this picture, but you know, we were everybody. While they cleared the field, some of us decided to take it easy and work at the DC archives. Has anybody here been to the DC archives? Not easy.
It's Naylor Court, right?
Pardon?
Naylor Court?
Naylor Court, it's finding it is is a challenge in itself. But they're talking now about moving it to the UDC campus, so.
Yeah, I saw something about that.
Yeah, that might take a few years, but
Hopefully not 20.
hopefully not 20. I can tell you 20 years is a while.
Yeah.
So how many of you know Barbara Bates, who's, yes,
AOI?
Barbara's a historian and a world traveler. She lives in Van Ness. And this is Shayla Monroe, who's from Tennessee, and she's was a Howard student. She's a Dr. Shayla Monroe now. She teaches anthropology now. I call these my children, you know, these young people. So while some of us toiled in the field, other of us dived into the documents because we still didn't know who was buried at Walter Pierce Park. And the name of the cemetery was Mount Pleasant Plains, and the Quaker Cemetery was called the Friends Burying Ground. So we hand searched all the available death certificates for the period of time that the cemeteries were in existence. And DC didn't begin keeping death records until the 1850s. So we couldn't recover many Quaker death certificates. We found 8,428 burials that we were able to document. And the way we found them was by looking at a death certificate. I don't know if you in the back of the room can see this very well, but place of burial, Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery, it says. So, this is Amelia Edmondson. Does everyone know the story of the schooner Pearl? In 1848, more than 70 individuals fled slavery by getting on a schooner and trying to go up the Chesapeake Bay. But that plot was foiled by at the mouth of the Potomac River. And Mrs. Edmondson had 6 children, 6 adult children on board the schooner. And she's buried in our cemetery, along with about 23 members of her extended family. She had a very large family, and they all got married and had large families.
Yeah.
So these are some of her descendants. Amelia is their matriarch. And Amelia was a good friend of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who became sort of a patron of the family and helped her daughters go to Oberlin College. And so it's probably in New York that Mrs. Edmondson had her photo taken when she was visiting Harriet Beecher Stowe up there. And Harriet said that one of the characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin was inspired by Mrs. Edmondson. And so by finding the names of everyone who was buried there, we know that Washington's earliest Quakers were buried there. They were the people who used thee and thou and friend instead of Mr. or Mrs. At least 45 Black Civil War soldiers and sailors, probably many, many times more, who we can't document because they didn't apply for pensions. Underground Railroad passengers and conductors of more than just the Pearl. There were other operations that were conducted, so much so that in 2015 we were able to nominate Walter Pierce Park to the National Underground Railroad Network. People who worked in the White House, we have people with ties to Monticello, people who worked in the Capitol, the courts, people who were coach drivers, teachers, maids, porters, bricklayers, singers. We have some singers that won contests, and I always think we have such a rich musical tradition in DC. We know sometimes where they start. We have people who were witnesses in the Lincoln conspiracy trials, the Lincoln assassination trials. We have the first, yes?
Just curious, how do you know the professions, did you do research?
Once you know the name and the age of a person,
Uh-huh.
then you can go into newspaper archives and see if they ever did anything newsworthy. I mean, unfortunately, that's a small group of people whose names actually get in the paper,
Yeah.
but I think they're of interest to us now because these were historical events,
Uh-huh.
and so we,
Were you able to use the census to?
yes.
Yeah.
There's a genealogist in the
Well, that was gonna be
audience.
my question. I've recently started doing some family research.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating in the census to see what the professions were. And a few other things like, did you own a radio? Or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, at certain points, they wanted to know different things, so.
There was a woman named Susie Ann Jackson who I started trying to track down, and I don't know why. Oh, I know why, because she's mentioned in a book, They Knew Lincoln. It's a book about people contemporary with Lincoln. And unfortunately, she's sort of denigrated in that, but I thought, that might be, sexism or, something, classism.
Right.
So I went on the trail of Susie Ann Jackson, and her maiden name was Susan Ann Delaney. She came from Maryland. She had come to Maryland about 3 weeks before the assassination of Lincoln in 1865, and she was working for Mary Surratt
Oh my.
in her boarding house on, is it H Street in Chinatown, 6th and H? And she happened to be pretending to sleep on the floor. People didn't have, servants' quarters in Mary Surratt's boarding house. So she pretended to be asleep on the floor, and a group of men were discussing the assassination. And consequently, she, through her cousin, her older cousin who lived nearby, went to the police and gave this information, and it put the police on the trail of Mary Surratt's son and other of the co-conspirators. So that was Susie Ann Jackson, and she's one of the, a handful of people to receive a prize, a monetary prize for her investigative lead. But she was just sleeping on the floor and pretending to be asleep and keeping one ear open. So I'm very proud to say she's one of the people whose remains were buried in the cemetery. And mostly we have people who came to Washington during and immediately after the Civil War. They were self-emancipated people, not wealthy, but determined to start good lives here in Washington. So how did all this disappear? In one word, development. The National Zoo wanted to create itself. And so they came to the Colored Union Benevolent Association, which owned the Black Cemetery, and said, what's your best price? And this Benevolent Association of activist black men voted not to answer the zoo. Eventually, a couple of acres of land was condemned and placed within the National Zoo boundaries. There was always pressure as the neighborhood was developing. And so one of the last surviving trustee of the organization, a man named Charles Shorter, went to the court in 1913 and said, I'm seeking a court order to have the cemetery closed. We want the graves respectfully removed and put elsewhere. And we want the court to decide if there are any profits in the sale of the land, how that might be divided among the heirs of the cemetery. He would die, but by 1923, a court had agreed to do that, and so it also appointed trustees. Some of the land was bought as land along Rock Creek Parkway, went to the National Park Service, and then some shady developers managed to get a hold of the remaining African American cemetery land and the Quaker land. And several large apartment buildings were going to be built on the site, but then World War II happened, sort of slowed things down. but by the 1950s, they started excavating the site and remains started turning up. I don't know exactly what caused them to stop because they kept going, but the buildings never got built. And by the 1970s, folks in the neighborhood saw this vacant piece of land and wanted it to be a park. Congress at that point had to buy the land to make it a park and give it to the city. So it became Walter Pierce Park, and that's the sad part of the story. So through archaeological field work, ground penetrating radar, which says there might still be thousands of graves in the park at depths too great, and historical research documented 2 cemeteries that were almost lost to public memory. So how do we make sure they're not lost again? The answer's simple. That's why we're here today. Public engagement. This is Mark Mack leading Quakers on a tour of the park. There's some kids from one of the elementary schools. They were funny as could be. These ladies are from the African American Civil War Museum. They're great friends and supporters of ours. Neither of us has any money, so it's not that they support us monetarily. We just like each other. And then there's some young reenactors who used to be part of the Marie Reed School cadets, honoring the 45 soldiers and sailors buried at the park. Every spring, and we haven't scheduled this yet, we have a Sing Their Names event where we read all the names simultaneously from different lists in groups, and we invented this, by the way. We had all the names, so we thought, how do we say all the names? Everyone reads from a different list, and with about 40 people, we can read all the names in about 35 minutes. And then we have a lot of food. So here's a woman reading from a list. That's what you're seeing in that little photo. But you'll see it's a mixed race group. It's all ages. They all just want to be part of this. We got our very first markers in the park in 2021. We had proposed that the city put markers in, but they didn't want to. Or they sort of said they did want to, but they weren't doing it. So during COVID, I thought, end run, little strip of land is National Park Service land. Let's go to the National Park Service. And we got money because we were a National Underground Railroad site. And it wasn't exactly a neat end run, but we got 4 markers in commemorating the Underground Railroad ties to the park. And this is at the Calvert Street entrance. And these are descendants dedicating the signs in 2021. Just a couple more pictures here. So this is what we proposed to the city in 2018 before COVID. We wanted all the names on the signs, all the names, ages, and death dates. And the descendants of the folks buried there went through a very deliberative process to come up, excuse me, with this plan. But again, there was reluctance. For some reason, after we got the National Underground Railroad signs in, the city re-engaged with us. And so this, probably in a few months, we will have 9 signs stretching across an existing wall because we don't want to disturb the ground. That feature the names, ages, and years of death of all the folks. So we just finished completing the signs. They're at the manufacturer now, and they'll be ready within a few months. Yeah.
How did all those who were, now know that they're ancestors, how were they identified? Or did they come forward when you published
They
them?
sort of popped up.
Okay.
In the age of the internet, we make a lot of connections. And we have the database of all our names on a website.
So people found the name from the website and then.
A lot of these folks turned up on walking tours and at public events.
Oh.
And I think you all know that some people are much more interested in family genealogy than others.
Uh-huh.
So occasionally, like one woman who came to sing at one of the events, she heard some familiar names when we were reading the names. And she looked at the written database that we brought with us, and she found 12 of her ancestors on there. And the reason she knew they were hers is we also have the addresses where folks died. And so all those folks were at known family addresses in the district. So, but she did not become involved. But who we have in our most active group of descendants are descendants of each cemetery's founders. We have a Quaker, we have literally the several times great-grandson of a man named Jonathan Shoemaker who donated land for the Quaker Cemetery in 1807. And he's very active. He lives in England, but we communicate. We have descendants of the Edmondson family, and believe me, there are quite a few descendants, and they're very active. We have descendants of a family named Shorter, who are relatives of Sally Hemings. They can trace back to a mother, and they're probably relatives of mine because I'm also descended from Thomas Jefferson's grandfather. But, we're all one big family anyway. Those of us who get involved in these things, yeah.
When you said that the DC government said they would put up the signs and then sat on it, that
No.
reminds me of the keep and kill thing that they're talking about with the Trump, stuff where they would.
It kind of felt that way. I felt like we were dating the district for a while and then they ghosted us. So,
But did it go into COVID times where they might not have wanted to expend any additional funds too?
well, COVID COVID delayed
Yeah.
things, but, I mean, I kind of gave them the benefit of the doubt as long as we were all locked down.
Yeah.
Did the district ever try to take the land through an eminent domain or anything like
The
that?
district now owns Walter Pierce
Oh,
Park.
so,
It is
okay.
a city park.
Oh, okay.
So that's why we had to work with the district, which I think you all know can be a little bit tricky.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, a lot had happened during COVID, including changes in thinking about social justice. With all the horrible police murders of black men and women. I mean, we came from a different place when we re-engaged with the city. We actually made some demands on them. We kind of let them come up to us rather than us going down to them.
How did the city get the land from those folks who originally purchased it?
The developers, yeah.
Right, what
that's-
happened to them?
The developers in the 1950s, after digging up an unknown number of graves, abandoned the land. Apparently it was no longer a good deal development-wise, and the city bought it from them.
Were the bodies relocated when the developers dug up?
The bodies went to the morgue. Some of them went to the Smithsonian. Some of them went to Woodlawn Cemetery. We don't even have a count on the number, but we know that thousands were not removed.
But when the city said that they had removed them, was there any record of where they were, the various other cemeteries or
When
the
we,
disposal?
it's a good question. Was there any record of where the bodies had been moved? And the answer is yes and no. We looked at disinterment records when we were looking at death certificates at the DC archives. And in some cases, families had loved ones deliberately moved to other cemeteries. But really, I would say that we found evidence of fewer than 300 removals. And that's really a liberal estimate on my part. So anyway, I was gonna just show you the kind of little stories that we put on the signs. This story is in honor of a woman named Charlotte Norris Nugent, who was the wife of a black spiritual leader named Eli Nugent. He was the founder of Asbury Methodist Church downtown. She was his second wife, and she was born at Riverdale Plantation out in Hyattsville, Maryland, or next to Hyattsville, Maryland.
It's a great place to visit, by the way.
It's a beautiful, beautiful mansion. Very rustic inside, but a mansion on the outside. But Charlotte gained her freedom her freedom was recorded at a very young age because her mother was the mistress of the Lord of Riverdale Mansion, the married lord. We don't know if Charlotte was his daughter or the daughter of an English indentured servant. But her freedom was recorded very early, and she, in the 1830s, with her friends, created one of the earliest black schools in the district, against all odds. So we have these kind of incredible stories that we hope people will enjoy knowing, even if they don't have any ancestors on this. We call this the Ancestors Pavilion, by the way, which is a little grandiose, but so this is the website, and you will find our burials database on there with names, ages, causes of death, place of death. In later years, people recorded how long people had been in the district, which tells you a lot, like if the person came here during the Civil War or not. And like I said, probably most of our adults did. Most of the people buried in the cemeteries were children, because childhood diseases did not have remedies.